All right. Welcome, our imaginary viewers,
Hi.
to our experimental name number 2, T&G Philosophy. Grace had no say on this, but I'm trying out
Yeah,
different. What?
I like it. I said I didn't know that was happening, but I like it.
Well, I had a existential crisis when they were like, "What's the name of your podcast?" And I'm like, "What is the name of our podcast?"
Wait,
Last time I was just messing around. Well, last time I did philosophy because of fun, but it's not very catchy.
yeah, that's true.
So I was like, "Do I want that? Am I going to enter this a second time and make it a thing, or do I want to change it now?"
It's true. Change it every time. Why not?
I like it. This one rhymes, so if we ever do come to a solid one, I think this is a good candidate.
Rhyming is always good, for sure.
Rhyming means truth. That's going to be my final stance. We're going to come around about. I'm going to try to find a way to work it into our philosophy discussion.
And like, is that like the goal of the entire podcast as like a series, or is that just the goal of today?
The
Right.
goal of the entire podcast is to prove that rhyming is truth.
Yeah. Okay.
I like that. It will be challenging because I don't actually believe that yet, but maybe we can find our way there.
Well, maybe yeah, it's a challenge.
Maybe rhyming is pretty a shadow in the cave.
Rhyming is well. I don't know, we can get into some detail on the cave today.
That's true. All right, so tangent, but welcome to T&G Philosophy. This is the name for this week. It might change every single week. We'll find out. We know as much as you do. So we are planning on talking about a really popular theory. Would you call it a theory?
I think it's
The allegory.
it's an allegory. I mean,
Very literally an allegory.
very literally. I guess it's like well, it's part of the Socratic dialogue. So like maybe a scenario.
Yes, it's a really popular scenario in like Western culture's consciousness when it comes to philosophy. It's one of the first things that people will like conjure up if you ask them about a philosophical topic in the West.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. And Grace, you already got started on it, so why don't you go ahead and explain where Plato's allegory of the cave sits amongst the Socratic dialogue, if you know that much about it.
Okay. So yes, we are today talking about the allegory of the cave. It's in Plato's writing. He has a lot of he wrote the Socratic dialogues essentially. So he wrote like the Symposium, the Republic, etc., etc. Allegory of the Cave is in the Republic, and essentially it's a dialogue between Plato's brother, Glaucon. I don't know how to pronounce his name at all, and his mentor.
He won't be upset.
Yeah, he can't be. And his mentor Socrates. Obviously, it's a Socratic dialogue. So it's narrated by Socrates, and essentially it's this huge story talking about the divide of people who are seeing truth versus seeing essentially like the shadow of truth. So yeah, I don't know, Tim, do you want me to like describe it now? Or
Sure. Yeah, give it a shot. There's actually a couple different versions that I've heard, so I want to hear which one you go through and if it has all the steps or if it's the like simple version.
So I've heard multiple versions too, but essentially there are prisoners in a cave. From what I understand, they're actually imprisoned, and so they're like their necks, like they have to be staring at a wall. So they have like chains and stuff that's keeping them to stare at this wall. Behind them, there's a fire, and the fire casts shadows onto this wall. So people will basically just carry around objects or use puppets essentially to, I don't know, mold these prisoners' idea of reality. That's really weird to say, but essentially all these prisoners know is what's in front of them. So their perception of reality are shadows on the wall of a cave. So I think what happens is Plato then supposes that somebody gets freed from this cave. So if people are, say, like the normal person is chained to the wall, staring at this wall, looking at the shadows of life. And then all of a sudden one person gets freed and they actually look and see the fire. Essentially he gets blinded because he can't comprehend the light of the fire. It makes it difficult to see what is happening. He can't comprehend that the fire is the real thing and the shadows are the fake thing. And so the prisoner would instinctively run back to staring at the cave wall, looking at the shadows. And then they have to, and then there's another situation where I guess he's forced to see outside, I guess drag him all the way out of the cave until he goes and sees the sun, which is like a completely different level of like, oh my gosh, I can't comprehend this. And that blinds him as well. And eventually his eyes adjust to the sunlight and he can actually see shadows to begin with, because obviously your eyes are adjusting, but then he starts to see the real world for what it is. And once he has his eyes adjusted, only then can he really like see what's around him. And then once he sort of realizes what this real world is, he tries to re-enter the cave to tell everyone about it, but he is then blind when he re-enters the cave because it's so dark. I don't really know where it goes from there. But that's just kind of like the different like suppositions of like, well, what if this happened? Well, what if that happened? Well, what if this happened? I don't know. Did I hit everything?
Yeah, that's pretty much everything I heard on the more elaborate version. I think the quick notes version is there are people in a cave, there's a fire, and there's shadows cast on the wall. The people in the cave think that's reality, but someone leaves the cave and sees reality is different. And I think the original version had those extra steps where there's a bunch of prisoners who have no choice but to look at the wall, and there are people behind there's a wall dividing the fire and the people, so the people only ever see shadows of the puppets or objects. They never see human shadows. So they don't even know that humans are a thing. They only think that shadows exist. And then the person escapes the first tier and then sees the fire in the pots and can't comprehend it. It hurts their eyes and it's painful. So they go back to the fire, like to the shadows that they started with, and they're kind of happy there. Mm-hmm. And then same thing, someone drags them out. They slowly have their eyes adjust and they experience shadows. They get to see things through the reflection of the water, and then they get to see the actual objects. And then the final step is actually looking directly at the sun and having their eyes adjust so well that they can see the sun, but that would be very dangerous.
Don't look directly at the sun.
Yeah, and then they go back because they're so excited to share it with their bros who are locked up in the cave. And Plato theorized that somebody who had seen all that stuff would come back and try to convince everybody else that what they're seeing is a lie. But since they can't see well in the caves, they can't tell what's going on with the shadows. The people in the cave think they're stupid and would violently resist the person who's left attempt at freeing them. So he's like, here, let me undo your shackles, come with me. And they're like, get away from me. I will use violence if necessary to prevent you from freeing me from the shackles.
Yeah. Some crazy stuff.
Yeah, pretty much. There's one other detail I think we forgot to mention. There was a game that the people in the cave, in the supposed cave, played where they would try to guess what shadow would be marched out next from like behind the wall that separated them from the fire. And the people who could guess correctly the most often were deemed the wisest people in the cave.
Wow.
So when the guy comes back, people start asking him what's going to come next, and he's like, I don't know, I can't even see. And they're like, well, you clearly lost your wits because you can't tell what shadow's coming next.
Yeah. That's crazy. I didn't know that part. That's funny. Okay. So essentially, this is, obviously it's an allegory. It's called the allegory of the cave. But it's, I guess the argument that Plato is making is that this is how we perceive reality. So the general person's perception of reality are just shadows of what reality truly is, and that we essentially have to be forced out of our comfort zone to explore the possibilities of another reality. There are so many layers that will we ever get to the true essence of real things? Maybe, maybe not.
Pretty much. And I think that I've read that Plato was even more like extreme, and he said that being in the cave is like everyone in the cave are people who are relying on their senses as a way of gathering information.
Exactly. Yeah.
So any empirical evidence, anything that you see and you think it must be so, he says that's a shadow on the wall. And the only way to move up in levels is to use logic and philosophy to determine truth in your through your mind and not through your senses, because your senses can't be relied upon.
Yeah, essentially. And I think that's really interesting because Plato really took that like really far with like this idea of this isn't what you see here doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually there. It doesn't mean that it's real. It doesn't mean that that's the true form of that thing sort of concept. It's really interesting if you like delve deep into it. But what's also interesting is that Aristotle like believed the complete opposite. So, which was his student. So
That's true.
But I was gonna say, I actually lost my train of thought. Okay, I lost my train of thought. Never mind.
Got it. Well, so it's interesting because it's very like it makes you a very suspicious person in general. It's like if you cannot trust your senses at all. I guess this is the Descartes kind of issue where if you can't trust your senses at all, how can you trust the logic that you gain from your senses? And it makes life very difficult to navigate if this is your like main way of understanding knowledge just feasibly. It can be very good to construct your sense of knowledge this way, but it would be very hard to live your life actually practicing it.
Yeah, I think that's where that sort of theory breaks down. Is it's really hard to find. Well, obviously, there's no proof. Isn't really something that you'd be looking for, but it's really hard to like justify that like your kind of basically what you just said, like your logic is still like correct if you're assuming that nothing is as it is, or how you perceive things is not how it is. So that's definitely like one portion of it that just like falls apart, I think. I also think that in some, I mean, I could be wrong, but in some instances, like with the allegory of the cave, essentially Plato's saying like people who've seen the light, so like people who've either made it to the sun are like philosophers, and then everyone else is like
plebeians.
Everyone else, yeah.
The plebs.
Brings us back to that idea of like philosophy being this hoity-toity, unattainable like thing we can't discuss.
That's true. It does have a very like elitism kind of baked into it.
Yeah.
And I guess there's, if you're dividing people into the people who have seen the light and the people who haven't, there's no way to make it not one person feels slightly better about their situation than the other.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess depending on what you set the bar at for a philosopher, it can be a good guiding star to people who go about life curiously and trying to see if what they think is correct, or people who do not like new information at all and try to avoid disproving themselves. And if you make anybody who tries to see if they are correct a philosopher, then I think it's at least a little bit less alienating of a thing to suggest.
Yeah. No, I definitely think that like the concept of pursuing beyond what you can sense, like with your senses, is pretty interesting. Like basically what you're saying. Like if you are going to just go off of what you have in front of you and basically fight to make sure that you're considered right, even if you're wrong, then that's a problem. So I think the exploration of what's beyond the cave is very important. But I think what's also interesting is this idea of being blinded. Like, you can't, I mean, I guess from what I understood of Plato's allegory of the cave is that, like, no one really, not everyone would be able to actually go, like, and stare at the sun. So, like, that's, like, like, only some people are able to, like, handle that. And so that's something that you, like, work towards. And I also think it's interesting because, like, you mentioned the reflection on the water, which is basically what I think Plato thinks we see as, like, people, and, like, what we see in our tangible lives, corporeal lives, is just a reflection of what the real thing is. And you know how water slightly distorts things, so we're seeing similarly to what it might be, but can never know what it truly is, because that's kind of like what our perspective is as humans, is kind of staring into a reflection in the water.
Yeah, it's like I think a lot of people actually have the experience of their senses lying to them. Like, and if they really think about what that means, it means that you're only viewing an approximation or a very detailed symbolic representation of what the universe is like.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think, I forgot what I was going to say.
So, yeah, I don't think this is exactly what Plato was talking about, but that the idea that there is, like, reality is really a simulation in your head, no matter what stance you take. Like, there's many philosophical routes to that same conclusion that what you see is what your brain thinks is the most useful way for you to see the information that it's gotten so far.
Right. No,
So,
that's like the human brain sees patterns and things like that. We see faces and everything. We're trying to make sense of what is in front of us by comparing it to what we already know.
yeah, one of the most extreme examples would be a specific case where a seizure can disconnect your, like, visual processing in your brain from the actual organs, but the visual processing center still is connected to your cortex in a way that sends information. So you can go blind from a seizure and still think you can see, because your brain's just making up what it is assuming is going to be there.
Right.
And it's a very, like, very potent experience, apparently. Like, people have had this experience where they have a seizure and they go blind, but they don't know it. And the doctors are like, how many doctors in the room? They're like, there's one doctor in the room. I'm talking to you. And they're like, no, there's 5 of us standing right here.
Wow.
Why could you not tell there was 5 of us? He's like, oh, you're right. I didn't notice all of you standing right in front of me. Or some people will go so far as to, like, the approximation's good enough that they can get out of the hospital and they'll come back, and someone will take them there because they keep running into invisible walls, which are walls they did not see and their brain did not think was there.
That's crazy.
Which is, like, super, they're, like, living the purest example of what Plato imagined our, like, philosophical relationship to knowledge was.
Yeah, well, to reality, but yeah.
Yeah, to reality, yeah.
That's crazy. Wow. Yeah, and that makes me think of, like, well, one, the body is such a powerful thing. That's, like, there's so many things that it can make us think is happening and it isn't, and it's really insane. I'm thinking, like, phantom limbs and, like, all this craziness. But I want to come back to, because we've been talking about kind of, like, Plato's stance. I was trying to think of the name of, like, his theory that basically the allegory of the cave kind of helps explain, and it's the theory of forms. And that's what I was like, I kept losing my train of thought because I couldn't think of the name of it. But essentially, it's basically what we're saying. Like, it's his argument that the non-physical is, like, the forms represent the most accurate reality. So not, like, the physical forms, but the non-physical forms. And so, like, and that's kind of what I was getting at with, like, essence. Like, the essence of a table is not, like, the table that we see in front of us that we can touch and feel. There's something beyond that. that we can't really know. But in order for us to understand what a table is, we have the concept of table. Did you feel?
Yeah, and everybody, like the normal stance is to be like a table, and you imagine like a table that you've seen and be like, that's what a table is. But
Yeah.
the ideal situation would be to find the ultimate quintessential form of a table, and that would be what all these tables are kind of reflecting through the corporeal realm.
The one table to rule them all. Yeah.
Which
And
is
go ahead.
which is a great example of that kind of like unwieldiness of like if even if that's true, which in a way I think it totally is, like basically on what we talked about earlier, but is it useful to model your world that way?
Right.
Like, does that help you at all, or is it just kind of like a fun fact? What you're seeing in the table is kind of like what your brain thinks a table is, plus some sensory input. But really, that's not what a true table is. And you're like, that's cool.
Yeah.
Where does that get me? How does that interact with my actual life?
Well, I think it comes back to that idea of like you're constantly pursuing beyond like your immediate judgment of things, which is kind of helpful. But if you do that for literally everything, then I think you just become an annoying paranoid person who doesn't trust anything. So
on a chair. I don't see chairs.
That's not a real chair.
That's not a true chair. I can't sit on that.
I can't. Yeah, exactly. Like
a true me can't even sit because it's not a physical thing. So.
But also, I think what's interesting is it makes me think of I don't know if you ever heard of Edward Said, who wrote the book Orientalism.
I have not heard of this.
An English major tangent here. And I want to be sure that I'm thinking of the right person. Let me see. I need to Google it because I could be wrong. It might not be Edward Said. It's so in English studies we have this thing called like literary criticisms, and obviously like it's usually split up by eras. One of them that's like super important is structuralism, and structuralism. Oh, I'm thinking of Saussure. Okay, Ferdinand de Saussure is this guy. He's basically the father of linguistics, essentially. But it's this concept of like the symbol and the symbolized, I guess. So like you think of dog, and automatically you think of like basically what you're saying with table. Like you think of an image of a dog, and like that's what you perceive a dog to be. But like what a dog is not that image, essentially. Like what's that thing? Like this is not a pipe or whatever. So like that's what it makes me think of in a linguistics point of view. So obviously like when we're talking about language, we have symbols to represent certain things, which then become symbolic and take on meaning, the same meaning of what the real thing would be, but it's in a different form. And that helps us, that basically allows us to communicate, which is kind of cool.
Yeah, I actually have heard of that like whole phenomenon discussed. I just didn't have a name attributed to the person.
Yes.
But yeah, that's what I was thinking about when I was talking about the image of the table, like exactly what you said.
Yeah, and it's actually pretty cool. So like, I mean, essentially like I said, it's like the father of linguistics. So he's the guy who started the study of language. So yeah, he has this idea of like sign and signified, and obviously different languages have a different sign or like different things, but the signified is always a united thing if you're talking about the same signified.
That's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So like there's like a, even though all the signs are different, the signified thing in his mind would be the same.
Exactly.
How does that work with let's say what you consider, oh, I can't think of a good example, but if you're talking about dogs, this is the first way I heard about this theory is, what is a dog? You think of like a Labrador.
Right.
and someone brings, and then part of your description is like, they're about this size, they behave kind of this way. But someone brings in a dachshund who kind of acts like a cat, and then you're like, is that a dog or is that not a dog? So obviously we have strict enough definition of species and breeds that we would be able to say that's definitely a dog, definitely not a dog. But if we didn't have that kind of dynamic and it was a little bit more freeform, different cultures might split the like barrier of where the sign is of a dog.
That's true.
Even though the signified would be the same in reality separate from those cultures. But like, let's say like Russian dogs aren't small, just to be stereotypical. You're like, oh, after this size, they're not dogs. We don't call them dogs. That's not a dog. Right. They're using their Russian word for dog, but we have a word that covers a wider, like a different range that's including what they signify as a dog.
Right. That is interesting. Yeah, I think it can get into that nitty gritty for sure. Like, of the signified can be something different, but I think in the general concept of things.
I think the general concept is very true. I think it's interesting because like that even removes it one level further from like there is the signified, like there's a sign, there's the signified, and then the how would I even say this? There's like the things that could be signified, and then different people can choose what sign is connected to how much of what is signified. It's like there's something separate from what the cultures decide to signify that is still kind of like ultimately true, kind of like Plato's conception of it. Like how it is in reality aside from our observation.
Right. Yeah, I kind of get what you're saying, I think. Maybe.
I don't think it was explained very well. This
no.
is free-formed. I'll come back to this because it's an interesting thought, but I don't think I'm able to express it fully here without looking into it more. So I'll put a bookmark in this.
Sounds
I come back later. I can't get my brain waves through the computer to you just yet.
That's okay. I understand. But anyway, so you were talking about like the practical application of basically the theory of forms, and that was kind of one of them. I don't necessarily think it's exactly the same, but I do think it's along the same idea of kind of what makes language work, which is kind of cool. But in a day-to-day life, I don't know how useful the theory of forms is. I honestly just don't really agree with Plato on a lot of stuff. Like,
yep.
Aristotle, I liked a little bit more. That's partially because Plato, because he felt this way about like reality and stuff, he was like, art sucks, we don't need art, it's stupid, we don't need anything, writing sucks, it's gonna make us stupider, nothing is good. And I'm like, but actually, a lot of these things are pretty useful, so, but that's just
true.
And I find that interesting actually, because I think like Plato is one of the big people who is like, if you write, then you're losing some of your intelligence, because if you don't write things down, then you're forced to remember them. But if you write it down, then you forget them because it's already written down. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's a really interesting thing. I don't know. I mean, I can kind of understand like that idea, but also like as someone who enjoys writing and thinks writing is really great, and also like as someone who is obviously in a place where people write a lot more than they did in ancient Greece. I think that it's probably one of like our most useful uses of language and communication.
Yeah, that's a common theme of new media must be making us stupider because we're able to store more information and we don't have to think of as much information. And this is a little bit separate, but I think that's almost always going to be a fallacy. If something allows us to keep and store and process more information while allowing us to assimilate more because we're not having to store it, we'll pretty much always be better off until we lose everything we've stored. Yeah. But at that point, we're facing the apocalypse anyways, and we'll probably be like being blown up by a meteor or some solar flare flying in our atmosphere. So it'll be done anyways.
That's the There are children screaming outside. I'm sorry if you can hear that.
That's pretty creepy.
I don't know what they're yelling
Are they
about.
screaming like "woo" or screaming like "ah, we're getting murdered"?
They're not like screaming like they're gonna get murdered, but they're like screaming like they're yelling at each other, but like not using words.
Oh, well,
So
that's better than the murder.
yeah, no, I agree. I agree too. Yeah.
If you didn't agree, that would be horrifying.
No, I don't agree. They should. I lie. But yeah, I was gonna say something. All right. Well,
The train of thought has once again changed tracks.
It's been derailed.
It's been derailed.
Yeah.
All right. Well, back to the usefulness of the theory of forms, or more specifically, the allegory of the cave. I always like how whenever somebody talks about it, they imagine themselves as the freed person. But that's statistically, in Plato's point of view, never the case. Like, the majority of the people were prisoners, so the odds are that you're a prisoner, and that your conception of enlightenment was just being good at naming shadows.
Yeah.
I think one of the takeaways you can get from this is when you're talking about it, one, in real life, everything's complicated. So it's like there's caves with a bunch of different exits and a bunch of different realities at the end. Like the allegory breaks down, but basically you can be enlightened in some areas and still be in the dark in others.
Right.
And then if you understand that matrices of ignorance that's comfortable and you might not have addressed yet, and things that you truly know, and how there's different stages of knowing, you can be sympathetic to people who might not have information, and be aware that you are almost always going to be constantly lacking information, and then use it to have a very more constructive and empathetic way of discussing things with other people who haven't heard of stuff before, or being aware that you might not have heard of stuff before as well.
Yeah, definitely. And that makes me think also, I don't know, the idea of having conversations with people who might not have all the information. The last portion of the allegory where the prisoner that was let free, or basically dragged out of the cave all the way, tries to come back and tries to tell people what's going on. I think part of it, I think that's something that we need to discuss. I don't know how it really applies to the application, but it makes me think of that portion. And it makes me think essentially that idea that people are ahead of their time. I don't know. I feel like that's a common phrase that we have for a lot of things that people think you're crazy until it can be done, and then once it's done, everyone realizes that you were right this whole time. I feel like it's interesting that that's been a concept for so long, and that once again, I think that kind of adds to the hoity-toityness of philosophy. Is essentially once you are enlightened, you can't see the world the way it was again, ever. But you also want to try to teach people, but sometimes that's really hard to do.
It's true. Do you think the people beyond their times, people say that because it's things other people haven't thought of, or things that people have thought of but thought weren't realistic, and then someone else was like, no, we can do this?
Well, I think that's a hard question, just because it makes it very generalized.
That's true.
So I can't say for sure that it's always one way or another. I do think that cultural backlash is a huge thing when it comes to innovation. And so if you aren't going to get the people on board who would either, if you're thinking in a consumer perspective, obviously, if the people don't believe that it's a thing that can be done, or don't think that it's worth investing in, it's not going to happen. But also just in any situation, if you can't get the people on board, then it's not going to turn out well. So Galileo, essentially, he was on, I guess house arrest is the best word to use for the remainder of his life, once he challenged the church about the solar system. So there's an issue, but obviously eventually we realized that he was right. And so I think in a lot of situations, I do think that people think things, or people discover things, or people want to pursue things, but then they don't either have the means or the support necessary to make that into something more. And so obviously over time things change, and maybe people will have more access to certain things, or people are less touchy about certain subjects and therefore are able to accomplish more with those concepts.
Yeah, I pretty much agree. That's where I was looking to go with that. Is a lot of times there are a few like leaders in like something that's ahead of their time, and I think there's actually tons of people who usually have thoughts similar to that, but the difference between having thoughts, having the means to do anything about it, and then having the like bravery or gumption to go against the cultural norms, um, makes it so very few people can actually like be visible when they are having those thoughts.
Yeah.
Like usually the cultural inertia is so scary that you can have a duality, like have a cognitive dissonance where you think one thing's like kind of incorrect, but really it's not worth rocking the boat until some brave soul comes up with a lot of resources and a lot of like uh, gumption, and they're like, all right, this is how it is. I can prove how it is. I'm confident, and I got the means to stand up to whatever backlash is coming my way.
Yeah, for sure. This is something that like we talk about a lot in leadership classes because I studied leadership. So like there's that sweet spot of crazy person for innovation versus like too basically unconfident, you know? And so like if there's something that you want to change, one, there are plenty of ways to do it, and there are really good ways, and then there are really, really bad ways. So I think in some instances you need that shock to a system where like someone is like, no, you're wrong. And then eventually that'll cause a domino effect of people starting to doubt the cultural norm. But I also think that in many ways, the sort of like sweet spot where you take into consideration the current cultural perspective and you take into consideration like why they believe that, and you have to kind of snake your way, which is a bad word, but like, you know what I mean? Basically like manipulate the situation to a better outcome for your.
Yeah, you want this person to sound like a good person, but your
I'm
word
using
choice
that.
is like, yeah, bad connotations. But I understand that the person you're describing is like trying to make a good change.
Right. So like you have to work with the people if you're gonna see like the changes that you want to see, essentially. And then there's also like not doing anything, but knowing that you should do something. So there are a lot of different like levels of it. So, and obviously a shock to the system can end terribly. So
Yes.
That's always not like the best way to go, but sometimes it's useful.
Yeah, I think the shock to the system thing is probably gonna, in a view, like a marketing or branding view, if you're thinking of target audiences, I think a shock to the system is usually gonna get people who have sort of that cognitive dissonance where they sort of believe the cultural norm because it's easy, and then they have another part of them that believes what this leader would propose.
Right.
And then when someone claims it so boldly, they have an opportunity to be like, you know what, I actually really do agree with that. But I think if someone has none of that cognitive dissonance, then they're not going to be, they're really, really unlikely to be converted by the shock to the system style. And they're the people who need that very delicate working with the beliefs and seeing if you can slowly, incrementally adjust them to something that'll be more palatable.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think both are effective. Like you can start off with a bang, get all the people who had the dissonance, and then that's where it gets into this is so generalized, we can't really talk about specifics, which one's better or not, but both can be viable ways of influencing.
Yeah. Which maybe the prisoner from the other side should have worked with that, but you know, it's fine.
Yeah, he was probably a little bit too pushy and excited.
Yeah. But I think that reminds me also, since we're talking about like innovation and change, which is super relevant just all the time, forever. It makes me think of like this idea of like there's like this technical like bell curve of people, like when a new technology comes out, there are like the people who jump on it who are like, oh my gosh, I need the newest things. It's gonna be so great. I don't care if it even works. Like, I'll shell out the money, whatever. And they like do it every single time something new comes out. And then slowly as it goes on, like those people like influence other people until it becomes like generally normal to have this new piece of technology. Then there's the other side of the curve where people who just like have a phone from like 15 years ago, you know, and like don't care about the increase in technology or like how it really affects things. But I think that's an interesting like application of the kind of concepts that we're talking about now is like there will always be that group of people that are always like, hey, wait, yeah, this is new, this is cool, this is different, why don't we like invest in it or explore it? And then eventually more people get on the bandwagon, essentially.
Eventually, yeah.
Yeah. Which is a fallacy. Don't get on the bandwagon.
Well, you shouldn't get on the bandwagon just to get on the bandwagon. But if there's a lot of people on a bandwagon and there are good reasons that they have gotten on, aside from the fact that other people are on the wagon, you shouldn't refrain from getting on the wagon.
This is true.
Don't anti-bandwagon.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's bad too.
Yeah, that definitely, yeah, for sure.
Like a lot of people like that. Suspicious. I'm gonna stay away from it.
Yeah. But yeah, so there are kind of applications. I guess we're kind of trying to assist the ending of the allegory of the cave more so now, talking about like how you can convert other people.
Yeah, it's interesting because you can never be sure. One of the interesting things about the allegory of the cave is the people in the cave are completely, entirely, 100% convinced that their situation is reality. And like they can have innovation in things that don't matter. So like there could be a guy who realizes that they're different tint of shadows and starts like talking about that. And people are like, holy crap, this guy's onto something. These shadows do have different tints. Maybe everything has a different meaning than we thought. Yeah. And it can have the same exact journey. Like he could see the tints and it's hard to understand everybody else's point of view without the tints of shadow. Yet this is a journey that's still taking place in the cave. Like he hasn't escaped. It's just he feels like he's making progress on understanding the shadows still. So sometimes we can be the enlightened person, quote unquote, you can't see my air quotes, yeah. Who is trying to help somebody else, but we're really just describing the shadow and we can never be completely sure. So it's an unending struggle.
Yeah. And like another thing too is I guess in the allegory, the prisoner is never out of the cave for that long. Like he's dragged out, but then eventually he's brought back. So there's literally no way for him to know like everything about the reality of reality / don't stare at the sun. So
this episode, if we had a Twitter, it would be hashtag don't stare at the sun.
Yeah, pretty much. But
important.
I mean, you, but like recognize that the sun is there, you know?
Yes. Realize that the sun is existing and appreciate it, but just don't stare at it.
Yeah. Pretty much.
Yep.
Yeah. It's an interesting way to, you know, if you like keep that in your mind regularly, I don't think people do. And I think that it could be detrimental if you do. But
keep what?
Could also
don't stare at the sun?
Well, no, that should always be in your mind. But no, this idea of like, and what I am is what I am perceiving a reality that like I want to accept / a reality that I should accept / should I delve deeper into this kind of thing.
So I do think this is one of the like bigger limitations of Plato's direct allegory of the cave meaning. I don't think that doubting your senses is super useful in your day-to-day life. Being aware that it's possible, but I think if you move to because there's a lot of dialogues that built off of the allegory of the cave, you use the same allegory and then insert some other perspective, and then you have a new conversation. Like the epistemological, how do you say the study of knowledge? Epistemology.
Epistemology.
Yeah, epistemology. That view of the discussion where the shadows aren't like just perception, but that's your day-to-day beliefs. I think that is the most useful conversation on like the allegory of the cave. Like if instead of saying never trust your senses, you say never trust your first instincts because your mind loves fallacies. then it's probably more useful. If you keep that in your mind, you're like, okay, my brain loves lying to me. Let me see if I can actually slow down and think about this for a second. That's like really useful.
Yeah,
But
definitely.
being like everything my eyes see is a lie, that's probably not going to get you very far.
Well, yes, that's it's very true. Very true. Yeah.
Or maybe it will. I don't know. I haven't
Well,
tried it.
I mean, yeah, it depends on how extreme you want it to be. Like, and I think that's when you get into the point of like the other people in the cave are starting to think that you're crazy. If you're like, nothing is real. That's not true.
Our lives are lies. I mean, they were. In the allegory, the lies were lies, so not wrong.
But how do we know if our lives are actually lies if we cannot perceive or comprehend the reality beyond our perception?
That's very true. We don't know if the crazy person, like who's homeless, just went homeless because they saw the truth, and we don't know.
Yeah, this reminds me of, I don't know, you listen to Night Vale. Welcome to Night Vale. Another
Yep.
great podcast. Are you caught up?
I am not caught up.
Okay. Well, Steve Carlsberg, he starts seeing like patterns in the sky of like essentially mapping out like what the true reality of Night Vale is. And obviously no one believes him for a really long time. It just makes me think of that, of this guy who's basically just saying like, there are little arrows in the sky, literally mapping everything out. And other people can't see it, but he can see it. And so the real question is he crazy, or is he just looking at the truth and no one else can tell?
Yep, and I love Night Vale. For anybody who's not aware, Night Vale is a mundane take on Lovecraftian reality. So everything that happens is absolutely insane. So the fact that they don't believe him, even though there are like aliens and tiny subterranean races and alternate dimensions as like part of a day-to-day life, like going to the drop off your mail, will probably encounter aliens, angels, and alternate dimensions just because that's how this town works. And they still don't believe them because that's their day-to-day life. Like, it's ridiculous, but because that's their day-to-day life, you know, that's how it is.
Well, and like these are also the citizens that there's a waterfront and they just accept that it's waterfront even though they're in the desert. And
yeah, there's no water at the waterfront.
Water, but there is water because it's waterfront.
But they don't believe the guy who thinks he sees arrows because that's ridiculous. It's very good like way of showing that we could be believing something that's totally crazy, and then somebody else could say something sensical, but we're used to the crazy, so we think they're crazy.
I think that's a good lesson too. Like if someone seems to have like some ridiculous perspective, it might be worth actually like listening to a little bit. But when it comes to that kind of level of like whatever we see isn't real / like there are,
it'd be hard.
Yeah, like maps in the sky. It's kind of hard to like, I don't know, believe that when you like our reality is so based in our senses.
That's true. I do think there's my main measuring stick of should I believe this thing that sounds a little bit crazy is how much of my understanding of the world would I need to deconstruct entirely for that to be true. So there's like a bunch of like what did you call them? Like they're not scams, but there's kind of just like ruses on the internet where they're like it's going to be dark for 15 days in November, and you are like, okay, why? That sounds a little bit insane. Like I can't think of anything that would cause that, but let me hear you out. And they're like, all right, well, Jupiter is going to release some gas because it's going to line up really close to Venus, and that's going to make the sun turn blue. And I'm like, okay, either everything I've ever read in any book about astronomy is wrong, or this is a hoax. That's what we're trying to think of, a hoax.
Right,
so, like, that's my measuring stick. It's like, if it's like one thing I might have misunderstood, I'm like, okay, well, we should investigate this. But if it's like, everyone's actually lizards and you can't see it because they all have like telepathy, I'm like, a lot of stuff wouldn't make sense. I would need to rethink a lot. I think we think a lot of my worldview if that was the case. Like if I have to deconstruct almost all that I've learned, I'm like, okay, probably don't need to investigate that. That's probably a hoax. If it's like one thing, I'm like, okay, that's believable. Let's look into it. Let's see if we can become closer to the truth.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think that's like essentially what Plato's asking you to do. not asking you to, but like.
I didn't. That was a personal letter. I'm very touched.
He was like, you need to stop it. Just stop. Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you have any other comments on the allegory of the cave, or do you think we're pretty much wrapped up?
I think that there's definitely like a lot more to explore in terms of Plato's take on reality, and then if we wanted to like go down the rabbit hole of all the different reality theories, then that would take a long time.
All of them, yes. So, well, I mean, I don't think we could ever be fully explored on the topic, but do you think we're at like a point where we're at like a tier? Like we've explored a certain level pretty well, and then when we get to the next thing, that's a whole other beast of a conversation? Or do you think we have a few pieces left on our plane of depth that we're talking on?
I think we pretty much covered like a good amount of it. I think we did a lot of speculation, which is always fun and wonderful. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's essentially what the allegory of the cave is like here for. Is like it's a scenario that obviously Plato had his point, but you can also derive a bunch of different meanings from it. So it's about kind of playing with the ideas of what reality is and all that. I think it's a good introduction into like an epistemological perspective of how do we know what we know.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a really great, the model that he came up with is really great for insert your symbols here and see where that gets you. Like, there's a lot of already like well-defined discussions about this, but I mean, you can be like, what if like the internet is the shadows, and where does that get us? So it's a brilliant structure of those tiered things, and you can kind of see how perception affects whatever you set as a shadow as a symbol. So I think it's really fun. I mean, you could have like endless discussions about what if this is the shadow.
Yeah, for sure. I agree.
Some of them are probably useless. Like, what if chairs are shadows? What if that's all the shadows were? And you could have a discussion on that for sure. It was probably wouldn't get you anywhere that you could walk away with something.
Well, imagine if like the people behind the wall were just carrying donuts and that's all they had. So like all you ever saw were shadows of donuts, and you didn't even see shadows of things that were like significant in the real world. It'd be a rough life.
This, as a like we're wrapping it up and ending. This is a tangent that's a little bit less related, but people who like criticize very small differences in artwork or other media like movies. There was an XKCD about if you put somebody in a situation where they observe a bunch of similar looking stuff, they'll always be able to tell a difference.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the example they had was like someone got put in a room of Bill Clinton eating like ham and mayonnaise sandwiches, and then after like a year they come out and they'll have very detailed opinions about what makes a good and bad Bill Clinton eating ham and mayonnaise sandwich pictures. But it would be funny because if all they saw was donuts, they would become extremely good at recognizing different types of donuts based on small differences in their silhouettes and sizes and like how dark the shadow is.
It's true.
They would have a very fine-tuned perception of donut shadows.
Well, they would have, of the shadows, but they would never be able to they wouldn't be able to say like, oh, this donut, very dense, doesn't have a hole in the center, a little grainy on the outside, is obviously a sugar-coated raspberry filled.
Well, yeah, I mean, they might call it like a schloopaloo because they don't know donuts exist. They'll just know a bunch of round holes, but they'll be really adept at differentiating, not really determining what they're from because they don't know they're from anything, but they'll be amazing at differentiating small differences in circles and circles with holes in the center.
That makes me think like maybe there's a way to like this is not ethical at all, very tangential, but like what if there was like a very specific job where you had to be like that critical of small detail, like would this be a viable training method? I don't know.
Sticking someone in a room with only things of the difference, like two people in the room and just let them like give them meals and like a good like living facility, and then all they can do for entertainment is look at the thing that they need to be trained to differentiate.
Yeah, and then eventually like they get thrust into the real world and probably get crazy, and
Yeah.
whatever.
Well, I mean, hey, if you get someone to sign a contract and they do it willingly, you're like, hey, I'll give you free housing and I'll pay you a mild sum for a year. You won't have any bills, and the only downside is the only form of entertainment you have is to look at these objects. That's it.
Isn't that just the Stanley's Parable?
No, actually, Stanley's Parable was very interesting to talk about, but yeah, totally different actually. But I can see the similarities. I can see why you would mention it.
The work situation thing, I think.
The work situation. I think the work situation is a almost cruel existential joke.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's like I don't think because I think your scenario is if you actually wanted someone to be able to differentiate things. I think Stanley's is like this is a symbolic representation of how useless work is.
But it's necessary.
Wait, have you played the newest one? Because I like the Stanley Parable, and there's like the like they had the mod and then they had the real game.
Oh, I don't know. Maybe not. Probably not.
Probably not. Well, super good game. Really good. We could, after a while, see what we can apply with our academic discussion of philosophy to Stanley's Parable, because it has a whole bunch of fun little nuggets in there.
We should also do Soma. I don't know. Did you figure out that situation, by the way? I know this is like super off topic, but the game Soma.
The game Soma?
Yeah.
Remind me of that again.
Okay, so, well, one, it's an awesome game, super good on Steam. I have not played it, like, personally, because I'm really bad at games, so it would take me a very long time, but I watched a walkthrough on YouTube, so there's that. But Trey bought it while we were still logged into your Steam.
Ah, yes, I remember that situation.
Yeah, and then, yeah, but do you still have it? That's my question.
No, I think Trey has it.
Okay, he like figured it out.
Yeah, he called support and he was like, "Hey, my friend came over and signed into their account, and then I accidentally bought stuff."
Okay, but anyway, so that game, it's by the same people who made Amnesia, but I think it's Frictional Games is like the name of the company. Some Canadian company. But yeah, that game has a lot of very interesting philosophies on what is humanity and AI and a whole bunch of stuff. So that if you ever play it, you should totally play it because it's great.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, I think it's definitely up your alley, for sure.
We're trying to get a Friction Games sponsorship.
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely.
This video / podcast sponsored by Friction Games. Hopefully in the future.
Maybe.
Probably not. Highly unlikely, actually.
Yeah, but it's fine. It's fine.
That's fine. That's fine, Friction Games. We see how it is.
But yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are plenty of like games that we could actually like analyze and stuff. Ooh, we should totally analyze like books too. Fun stuff.
I agree.
Okay, sorry, I got excited.
We can have like a once a month, like at the beginning of the month we talk about what we're gonna analyze, and at the end of the month we've gone through it and we've like thought about the things we want to talk about, and we've experienced the whole media, whatever we chose, like a book or a series or a game, and then we can talk about it.
Yeah, because we could only do like Black Mirror. We could do an episode.
We gotta pick a Black Mirror episode.
Exactly. Yeah, an episode.
There's a lot of topics involved there.
We could do multiple games, plenty of books. So
we pretty much have as. April says we should do The Man with Fire.
Whatever it's called.
The Man with Fire.
Oh, I don't know what it's called. The episode.
Oh, Man Against Fire. Yeah,
Against Fire.
Yeah, there's a really good Black Mirror episode that it would be super awesome to discuss. So we will talk about this.
I want to just be right back. That one's a good one. But anyway, yes.
Yes, actually, Black Mirror is super good.
Yeah.
Before we sign off for our viewers, all 0 of you guys, we should decide what we're going to talk about next week.
Next
And next week might need to be a really bite-sized one, because we'll have everybody, hey, we could just walk around Busch Gardens in between rides and have quick snippets.
Saturday?
That'd be cool. We can just record on the phone or something.
Yeah, I mean, I think all phones have recorders.
Yeah, let's
All
do
modern
it.
phones. Yeah. So we need to find a bunch of really nice, snippy, like bite-sized contents we could talk about.
We can have like all of the guest stars.
We could. We should like find a bunch of like really interesting questions and do interviews.
That'd be great. Let's do it.
All right, cool. Hopefully we don't procrastinate because this is coming up very soon, but we need to think of or find some really classic and interesting good philosophical questions.
I'll think of like 10 good ones, and then you can think of 10, and then we can kind of like let's
Pick
go
the
with
best
5.
ones. Yeah.
5. That's
Sounds
more
good.
fun.
All right, cool. And we are signing off. Goodbye, everybody.